The train conductor closed the carriage door with a solid, definitive thud that seemed to seal off the world behind us. He turned, the dim, flickering lights of the carriage catching the silver threads in his dark hair and the quiet competence in his posture. His uniform was crisp, a deep navy that seemed to absorb the weak light, and it fit his broad shoulders in a way that spoke of years of physical work, not just of wearing a uniform. He tipped his cap, a short, economical gesture that was somehow more respectful than a flourish. His eyes, the color of worn slate, found mine in the sparsely populated car. "Walk with me to the back," he said. His voice was low, a calm rumble beneath the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track. It was not a question. My heart gave a nervous, stupid little kick against my ribs. I was just a passenger, one of a dozen anonymous faces staring out at the rain-streaked darkness of the countryside. There was no reason for him to single me out. I was returning from my sister's annual family barbecue, an event that always served to highlight my own solitary existence. I'd spent 2 days smiling through conversations about mortgages and preschools, feeling like a ghost at the feast of a life I didn't know how to live. I was hollowed out, filled with the quiet ache of being an observer, and now this man, this stranger with a steady gaze and a voice like smooth stone, was speaking directly to me. I nodded, my throat too tight to form a word. I gathered my worn messenger bag from the seat beside me, the strap digging into my shoulder as I stood. I was acutely aware of my own rumpled clothes, the faint scent of wood smoke from my sister's fire pit still clinging to my jacket. Beside his pressed uniform and air of solid authority, I felt like a stray. He waited patiently, his presence a quiet anchor in the swaying carriage. He didn't rush me. He simply stood, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching me with an unreadable expression. As I stepped into the aisle, the train lurched, a violent shudder that sent a ripple of alarm through the other passengers. I stumbled, my hand flying out to brace myself against a seat back. The conductor's reaction was instantaneous. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his size, his hand landing firmly on the small of my back to steady me. His touch was warm, a solid patch of heat that seeped through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was over in a second, a purely practical, reflexive action. But the imprint of his palm lingered, a ghost of pressure that sent a shiver chasing its way up my spine. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice close to my ear. The scent of him was clean, like fresh linen and rain, with a faint, metallic undertone that I associated with the machinery of the train itself. He didn't move his hand right away. It rested there for a beat too long, a silent, weighty punctuation mark in the unsteady rhythm of the train. Then, as if remembering himself, he withdrew it, and the space he left behind felt suddenly, strangely cold. He turned without another word and started down the aisle. I followed, my feet feeling clumsy and disconnected from my body. I watched the back of his head, the way the dark hair was neatly trimmed above the crisp collar of his shirt. I watched the confident roll of his shoulders as he moved with the sway of the train, perfectly balanced, perfectly at home in this metal tube hurtling through the night. We passed the other passengers, their faces pale and anxious in the emergency lighting that had flickered on. A child was crying softly. An elderly woman was clutching her purse to her chest. No one paid us any mind. It was just me and the conductor, moving toward the back of the train, toward an unknown destination. My mind raced, trying to conjure a logical reason for this summons. Had I done something wrong? Was my ticket invalid? Did I look suspicious? My internal monologue was a frantic, buzzing swarm of self-doubt, a familiar companion on my journey through life. I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to point out that I didn't quite belong. It was a feeling that had settled deep in my bones since college, a quiet, persistent hum of inadequacy. He led me through the connecting passage into the next carriage, which was empty. The sound of the wheels was louder here, a raw, grinding roar. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the world outside into a chaotic watercolor of black and gray. He stopped beside the door at the far end and turned to face me. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows, carving sharp angles into his face. He looked older up close, the lines around his eyes deeper than I had first thought. They were lines of concentration, of long hours spent staring into the darkness. "There's been a mudslide up ahead," he said, his voice even, betraying no hint of alarm. The track is blocked. We're not going anywhere for a while. Possibly not until morning. The words settled in the space between us. Stuck. All night. The crying child in the other car suddenly made a lot more sense. I just nodded, absorbing the information. My own inconvenience seemed trivial. I had no one waiting for me, no urgent appointment to keep. My apartment would be just as empty and quiet tomorrow as it was tonight. Why did you bring me back here? I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy against the noise of the storm. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted from my face to the window, to the torrent of rain beating against the glass. He seemed to be weighing his words, or perhaps weighing me. The main carriage will get crowded. People will be panicking, complaining. It gets loud. He paused, his eyes returning to mine. You seemed quiet. I figured you might prefer the peace. I am quiet. My heart does a strange little flip. He saw that. In a single glance, he had seen the core of me. I am the person who stands at the edge of the party, the one who leaves early, the one who finds solace in the silence that makes others uncomfortable. He had read me like a page in a book. It was unsettling and, in a way I couldn't yet define, deeply comforting. Oh, I said, the single syllable feeling woefully inadequate. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. It transformed his face, softening the stern lines. The heating in this car is unreliable. It's going to get cold. He gestured to a large metal locker in the corner. There are some emergency blankets in there, and a first aid kit, water bottles, the basics. He was giving me a choice. I could stay here, in the cold and the quiet, or I could return to the relative warmth and rising panic of the main carriage. It was no choice at all. I'll stay, I said, the words coming out with more conviction than I'd felt all weekend. He nodded, that same economical gesture as before. My name is Elias, he said, extending a hand. His palm was calloused, his grip firm and dry. It was a working man's hand. Leo, I replied, my own hand feeling small and soft in his. The contact was brief, professional, yet it felt charged with the same strange energy as his touch on my back. When he let go, I instinctively curled my fingers into my palm, trying to hold on to the fleeting warmth. Well, Leo, Elias said, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. Looks like we're in for a long night. He left me then, disappearing back into the main carriage to deal with the other passengers, his duty calling him away. I was alone in the empty car, the sound of the storm a wild symphony outside. I sank onto one of the cold vinyl seats, my messenger bag a heavy weight on my lap. He thought I was quiet. He had offered me a sanctuary from the noise. It was a simple act of kindness, of perception, but it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I leaned my head against the vibrating window, the cold seeping into my skin, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel entirely alone. I watched the door he had disappeared through, waiting for his return, a slow, unfamiliar hope beginning to dawn in the desolate landscape of my heart. Hours passed. The initial shock among the passengers in the other car seemed to have subsided into a weary resignation. I could hear the faint murmur of voices, the occasional cry of a child, but it was muffled, distant. Here, in my cold, quiet refuge, the world had shrunk to the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof and the low groan of the train settling on the tracks. I had retrieved a blanket from the locker Elias had pointed out. It was thin and scratchy, smelling faintly of dust and disinfectant, but it offered a small measure of comfort against the encroaching chill. I spent the time watching the rain. The drops chased each other down the glass, merging and splitting in frantic, chaotic patterns. It was mesmerizing, a microcosm of a world I often felt estranged from. All that energy, that movement, that inevitable collision. My own life felt more like a stagnant pool, still and undisturbed. I existed in the spaces between things, in the quiet observation of other people's lives. My job as a graphic designer allowed for it. I could spend days alone with my thoughts, translating abstract concepts into clean lines and muted colors, my only interactions mediated through emails and project briefs. It was safe. It was controlled. It was profoundly lonely. My phone had died hours ago, its black screen a useless mirror reflecting my own tired face. I had no book, no music, nothing to distract me from the relentless churn of my own thoughts. So I thought about Elias. I replayed our brief interaction, dissecting every word, every gesture. The tip of his cap, the low timbre of his voice, the steady, unblinking assessment in his eyes, the warmth of his hand on my back. I analyzed it from every angle, my mind a relentless detective searching for clues, for meaning. Was it just professional courtesy? He was the conductor, responsible for the well-being of his passengers. Perhaps he identified me as someone who might be prone to anxiety, and isolating me was his way of managing a potential problem. That was the logical explanation, the one that required the least amount of emotional investment. It was the explanation I tried to force myself to believe. But another, more persistent voice whispered a different story. It was in the way he had looked at me, a flicker of something beyond professional duty. A recognition. It was in the way his touch had lingered, a subtle pressure that communicated more than words. Or was I just projecting my own desperate yearning for connection onto a complete stranger? I was a blank canvas, and he had made a single brushstroke. I was already painting an entire masterpiece in my head. It was pathetic. Just as I was sinking into a particularly deep spiral of self-recrimination, the door at the end of the carriage hissed open. Elias stepped through, and the small, contained world of the empty car seemed to tilt on its axis, reorienting itself around him. He was holding 2 steaming mugs and a small, crumpled paper bag. "Thought you might be cold," he said, his voice a welcome anchor in the silence. He navigated the swaying aisle with an easy, practiced balance and sat on the seat opposite me, the vinyl groaning under his weight. He placed the mugs on the small table between us. The rich, dark scent of coffee filled the air, a welcome, grounding aroma. "This is," I started, at a loss for words. "You didn't have to do that. It's just coffee from the staff machine. Tastes like battery acid, but it's hot." He pushed one of the mugs toward me. It was a thick, heavy ceramic, chipped at the rim. I wrapped my cold hands around it, the heat a blissful shock. He then opened the paper bag and pulled out 2 slightly squashed-looking sandwiches wrapped in cellophane. And dinner, ham and cheese, the height of railway cuisine. A laugh escaped me, a short, rusty sound. I couldn't remember the last time I had laughed so freely. "Thank you, Elias. It's the least I can do. Keeping the passengers from starving is part of the job description." He unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite. He ate with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything else. No wasted motion. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the chewing, the sipping of coffee, and the relentless storm outside. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was comfortable, companionable. It was the kind of silence I usually only experienced when I was completely alone. To share it with someone else was a novel, and surprisingly pleasant, experience. I watched him over the rim of my mug. The harsh emergency lighting was unforgiving, highlighting the fatigue etched around his eyes. He looked tired, but not defeated. There was a resilience in the set of his jaw, a deep-seated competence that I found myself envying. He was a man who knew how to handle things, how to weather a storm, both literal and metaphorical. "Is it always this eventful?" I asked, gesturing vaguely at the rain-streaked window. He swallowed his bite of sandwich and considered the question. "Not always. But you see things on the night train. People at their most vulnerable, running away from something or running toward it. Everyone has a story." His gaze met mine, and it was intense, probing. "What's your story, Leo?" The question was direct, disarming. No one ever asked me that. They asked what I did for a living, where I was from. They asked about superficial things. He was asking about my story. I felt a blush creep up my neck. I am a closed book, its pages stuck together with the glue of fear and habit. "There's not much of a story to tell," I mumbled, looking down into my coffee. "I'm a graphic designer. I live in the city. I was just visiting my sister." He didn't press, but he didn't let me off the hook either. He just waited, his silence an invitation to say more. It was a powerful tool. I felt the familiar urge to fill the void, to babble nervously, but I resisted. I took a sip of the coffee. It did taste a bit like battery acid, but it was hot and strong. "My sister has a perfect life," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "A husband, 2 kids, a dog, a house with a white picket fence. The whole 9 yards." I tried for a light, sarcastic tone, but it came out sounding brittle and envious. "And that's not the life you want?" Elias asked. His question was gentle, without judgment. I risked a glance at him. He was watching me with that same steady, unreadable expression. He wasn't just making small talk. He was listening. I felt a dangerous urge to be honest, to crack open the carefully constructed shell and show him the lonely, confused person inside. I don't know what I want, I admitted, the confession hanging in the air between us, raw and exposed. I just know it's not that. He nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. It takes courage to admit that. Most people just follow the path they think they're supposed to. His words were like a balm on a wound I didn't even know was festering. He didn't see me as a failure, as an oddity. He saw it as courage. The thought was so revolutionary it almost made me dizzy. "What about you?" I asked, deflecting the attention away from myself. "Is this the life you wanted? Riding the rails in the middle of the night?" A genuine smile touched his lips this time. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Some days, I like the motion. The feeling of being in between places. You're not here, you're not there. You're just on your way." He looked out the window again, into the blackness. "And I like the quiet. The world goes to sleep, but the train keeps moving. It feels like you're the only one awake, keeping watch." His description resonated with me on a level I couldn't quite articulate. The feeling of being in between, of not quite belonging anywhere. He had put words to the defining sensation of my own existence. We were different in so many ways. He was a man of action, of quiet confidence. I was a man of inaction, of crippling self-doubt. But in that moment, sitting in a cold, stalled train car in the middle of a storm, I felt a profound sense of connection to him. A recognition. The train gave a sudden, violent lurch, much stronger than before. My coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug, scalding my hand. I yelped, dropping the mug on the table where it shattered, sending dark liquid and ceramic shards everywhere. "Stay put," Elias commanded, his voice sharp with authority. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a handful of napkins from his bag. He knelt in front of me, taking my hand in his. His touch was firm, professional, yet impossibly gentle. "Let me see." He carefully blotted the hot coffee from my skin. My hand was red and stinging, but I was barely aware of the pain. All I could focus on was the sensation of his calloused fingers against mine, the intense concentration on his face as he examined the burn, the way his proximity made the air crackle with a strange, potent energy. He was so close I could see the individual flecks of gray in his 5 o'clock shadow, could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. My breath is caught in my chest. This is too much. Too close. My entire world has narrowed to the space of a few inches, to the feeling of this man's hands on mine. The storm outside, the stalled train, the other passengers, it all fades away into a distant, muffled roar. There is only this. This quiet, intense focus. This unexpected, terrifying intimacy. "It's not too bad," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Just a first-degree burn. It will be sore." He didn't let go of my hand. His thumb began to move in a slow, soothing circle over my wrist, a gentle, hypnotic motion that sent a wave of heat through my entire body that had nothing to do with the coffee. I look up, and my eyes meet his. The slate gray has deepened to charcoal, and there is something in them I have never seen before. A question, a vulnerability that mirrors my own. The professional mask has slipped, and the man underneath is looking at me, really looking, and what he sees, I can't be sure. But he isn't looking away, and neither am I. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. The rhythmic drumming of the rain was the only sound, a steady beat counting down to something I couldn't name but could feel in every nerve ending. His thumb stilled on my wrist, but he didn't release me. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly, a silent communication that transcended words. He was still kneeling, our faces almost level. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. My own breathing was shallow, ragged. Every rational thought had fled my mind, replaced by a singular, overwhelming awareness of his closeness. The world had compressed to this single point in time and space, this bubble of shared silence and charged air. My entire being was screaming at me to pull away, to retreat to the safety of my shell, but my body was frozen, mesmerized by the intensity of his gaze. "Leo," he said, and my name was a rough whisper, a prayer, a confession. It was as if he was seeing it, tasting it for the first time. The power in the carriage chose that moment to flicker and die completely, plunging us into absolute blackness. The sudden absence of light was a physical blow. I gasped, a small, involuntary sound of shock. The darkness was total, disorienting. It swallowed the walls, the seats, the shattered mug on the table. It swallowed everything except for the solid, grounding presence of Elias's hand holding mine. His grip was my only anchor in the void. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice impossibly close in the dark. "Just a power failure. The emergency system will reboot." But I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what the darkness made possible. It stripped away all pretense, all the subtle social cues and masks we wear. In the dark, there was only presence, only touch, only the sound of another person breathing. I could hear his breath, slow and even, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of my own heart. He didn't move. He just knelt there in the darkness, holding my hand, his thumb once again beginning its slow, deliberate caress against my skin. It was a question being asked in a language my body understood far better than my mind. It was a question of boundaries, of permission, of want. My own thumb, of its own accord, moved to brush against the back of his hand. It was a small, hesitant gesture, a tentative answer to his unspoken question. I felt him inhale sharply, a quick, quiet intake of breath that was deafening in the silence. Slowly, carefully, he released my burned hand, and I felt a pang of loss, sharp and sudden. But then his hand was on my jaw, his callous thumb resting just below my ear. His touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through me that made my toes curl in my shoes. He was mapping the shape of my face in the darkness, a blind man learning a new and delicate geography. I am not breathing. I am pure sensation. The rough texture of his skin against mine. The faint scent of rain and coffee and man. The overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful proximity of him. This is the tipping point. The moment where the world pivots and can never be the same again. My life has been a long, straight, empty track, and he is the unexpected switch, shunting me into a new, unknown territory. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. It was a plea, a command, an offering of escape. But the word stop was not in my vocabulary. It had been erased, deleted, utterly annihilated. The only word in my mind was his name, Elias. I leaned into his touch, a fractional movement, a surrender. It was all the answer he needed. His other hand came up to cup the other side of my face, holding me as if I were something precious, something fragile. He tilted my head up, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't forceful or demanding. It was slow, tentative, exquisitely gentle. It was a question, a discovery. His lips were soft, warm, tasting faintly of coffee and something else, something uniquely him. It was a kiss of profound, bone-deep recognition. It was the feeling of coming home to a place I had never been before. I responded with a desperation that surprised me, my hands coming up to grip his shoulders, to anchor myself to him. I was kissing him back, not with any skill or grace, but with all the pent-up loneliness and yearning of a lifetime. It was clumsy and honest, and the most real thing I had ever experienced. He deepened the kiss, a low sound rumbling in his chest, a sound of satisfaction, of relief. His arms went around me, pulling me from my seat, half lifting me so I was kneeling on the floor in front of him, our bodies pressed together in the all-encompassing darkness. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against my own frantic rhythm. The scratchy wool of his uniform was rough against my cheek, an anchor of reality in the dizzying vortex of sensation. We stayed like that for a long time, lost in the dark, lost in each other. The kiss was a conversation without words, a story of two solitary souls colliding in the night. It was a confession of loneliness, a promise of connection. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air, he didn't let me go. He rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the cold air. "Leo," he breathed again, and this time, my name sounded like a resolution. Just then, the emergency lights flickered back on with a low hum, casting the carriage in their pale, ghostly glow. We blinked in the sudden light, two strangers kneeling on the floor amidst the wreckage of a shattered coffee mug. The spell was broken. Reality, harsh and unforgiving, came rushing back in. I saw the look in his eyes then. Not regret, but something akin to shock, as if he was as surprised by what had just happened as I was. He looked at me, his gaze traveling over my face as if to memorize it, and then he looked down at our intertwined hands, at the way our bodies were still pressed together. A slow flush crept up his neck, a sign of vulnerability that was so at odds with his usual stoic demeanor that it made my heart ache. He was the one to pull away first. He stood up, his movements stiff and awkward, and offered me a hand. I took it, and he pulled me to my feet. The space between us now felt vast and charged, a canyon of unspoken implications. I should clean this up, he said, his voice sounding strained. He gestured to the mess on the table, avoiding my eyes. The morning after was a study in silence. A thick, suffocating blanket of it had descended upon us with the first gray hints of dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and unervingly still. The sounds of activity from outside the train, shouted commands, the clang of metal on metal, signaled that our forced isolation was coming to an end. Elias had spent the remainder of the night in a state of professional alertness, periodically checking on the main carriage or speaking in low tones on his radio. He moved with a renewed, almost rigid, sense of purpose, the quiet conductor once more. The man who had kissed me with such desperate tenderness in the dark had vanished. I sat huddled in my seat, the scratchy blanket pulled up to my chin, feeling like a ghost. Had I dreamed it? Had the strange, liminal space of the stalled train and the disorienting darkness conspired to create a hallucination born of my own loneliness? But the faint soreness of my lips, the ghost of his touch on my skin, the vivid memory of his taste, these things were real. The burn on my hand was real, a faint red mark against my pale skin. He had tended to it, his touch so gentle. Now, he wouldn't even look at me. He had cleaned up the shattered mug with an efficient, detached air, his movements precise and economical. He had brought me a bottle of water and another blanket without a word, placing them on the table between us before retreating to the far end of the car. He stood with his back to me, staring out the window at the slowly lightening sky, a solid, unapproachable silhouette. Every instinct I had screamed at me that I had made a terrible mistake. I had misread everything. I had taken a moment of kindness, of shared vulnerability in a crisis, and twisted it into something more. He was just doing his job, comforting a passenger, and I had responded. I had responded with a hunger that must have terrified him. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, coiling serpent in my gut. I felt exposed, foolish, and profoundly, achingly alone. More alone than I had felt before he had spoken to me. The train gave a sudden jolt, a groaning shudder that ran through its entire length, and then, slowly, tentatively, we began to move. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track started up again, a familiar sound that now felt like a funeral dirge for the strange, magical night. We were moving forward, back to the real world, back to our separate lives. The bubble had burst. I watched the landscape begin to slide past the window, trees and fields still slick with rain, the sky a bruised purple and gray. We were leaving our small, isolated world behind. With every turn of the wheels, the distance between me and the man at the other end of the car seemed to grow, an emotional chasm widening between us. I should say something. I should apologize, try to explain, try to smooth over the jagged edges of my own desperate need. But what could I possibly say? Sorry for kissing you as if my life depended on it. Sorry for revealing the vast, pathetic emptiness of my existence. The words caught in my throat, a bitter pill I couldn't swallow. So I said nothing. I just sat, a statue of regret, and watched the world go by. We pulled into the station an hour later. The morning was bright now, the sun breaking through the clouds, making me squint. The platform was bustling with people, a chaotic scene of reunions and departures. The noise was jarring after the profound quiet of the night. It felt like coming up for air after being submerged for a long time. Passengers began to disembark, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. I gathered my messenger bag, my movements slow and heavy, as if my limbs were filled with lead. I had to walk past him to get to the exit. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on my own worn shoes, unable to bear the thought of seeing pity or disgust in his eyes. I was almost past him when he spoke. Leo. His voice was low, for my ears only. I stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I stood there, my back to him, bracing myself for the rejection, the polite but firm dismissal. I felt a light touch on my arm. He was pressing a small, folded piece of paper into my hand. My fingers closed around it automatically. It was thick, like cardstock, and warm from his touch. "Last night," he said, his voice still low, but clear and steady above the din of the station. It wasn't just about being stuck on a train. I finally found the courage to look up at him. His face was serious, his slate-gray eyes holding mine with a familiar intensity. There was no pity there, no disgust. There was something else, something I couldn't quite name. A question, a hope, the same hope that was now, against all odds, beginning to flutter weakly in my own chest. A whistle blew somewhere down the platform, a shrill, demanding sound. It was his call to duty. "I have to go," he said, his hand dropping from my arm. The loss of contact was a physical ache. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. I watched as he turned and walked away, his back straight, his stride confident, disappearing into the press of the crowd. He didn't look back. I stood on the platform for a long time, the river of humanity flowing around me, an immovable rock in the stream. My hand was clenched around the piece of paper he had given me. It felt like the most important thing I had ever held. Finally, with trembling fingers, I unfolded it. It was a piece of a ticket stub. On the back, in a neat, blocky script, was a phone number. Just a number. No name, no message. It didn't need one. The journey to my apartment was a blur. The city was loud, abrasive, a sensory assault after the cocoon of the train. Every face in the crowd was a stranger, every interaction a transaction. My apartment, when I finally reached it, was exactly as I had left it, silent, sterile, and empty. The air was stale. A pile of mail lay on the floor by the door. It was my life, waiting for me to step back into it. But something had shifted. The familiar, comfortable loneliness of my home now felt like a cage. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked over to the large window that overlooked the street. I watched the cars and people move below, a complex, interconnected dance of which I was not a part. I had always been the observer, safe behind the glass. But last night, I had been pulled into the dance. I had been seen. I had been touched. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, a purgatory of my own making. The piece of ticket stub sat on my kitchen counter, a silent, powerful accusation. It was a door, and I was standing on the threshold, terrified to turn the knob. My mind was a battlefield. One voice, the loud, familiar one, was the voice of fear. It told me I was a fool. It was a one-night thing, a fluke, an anomaly born of a strange situation. He was a kind man who felt sorry for me. If I called, I would only be met with an awkward, pitying rejection. He would let me down gently, and the humiliation would be 1,000 times worse than the quiet ache of not knowing. Better to preserve the memory as it was, a perfect, self-contained story, than to risk shattering it against the harsh wall of reality. But there was another voice, a quieter one I hadn't heard in a long time. It was the voice of hope. It reminded me of the look in his eyes that morning. It wasn't pity. It reminded me of his words. It wasn't just about being stuck on a train. It reminded me of the feel of his hand in mine, the solid, grounding pressure of his forehead against my own. That voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was real. Maybe this was the switch on the tracks, the chance to be shunted onto a different path. It asked me a simple, terrifying question. What if you're wrong about everything? What if you are worthy of being seen, of being wanted? I paced my apartment like a caged animal. I tried to work, but the lines on my screen blurred into meaningless shapes. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. I tried to sleep, but my mind replayed every moment of that night in excruciating detail. The darkness, the kiss, the return of the light, the devastating silence of the morning. On the third day, I woke up and the first thing I saw was the ticket stub on the counter, catching the morning light. It looked so small, so innocuous. Just a piece of paper with 10 digits on it. But it held the potential for everything. A new beginning, or a confirmation of my deepest fears. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't live in the in-between anymore. The train had started moving, and I had to decide if I was going to get off at the next station or stay on for the rest of the journey. My hand was shaking as I picked up my phone. I punched in the numbers, my thumb hovering over the call button for a long, agonizing moment. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed it. The phone rang. Once, twice. Each ring was a hammer blow against my fragile courage. He's not going to answer. It was a fake number. He's changed his mind. He's with someone. The litany of fear was a frantic chant in my head. On the third ring, he picked up. Hello. It was his voice. Not a memory, not a dream. It was him. Real, solid, and impossibly close through the phone. The low, calm rumble of it washed over me, silencing the frantic voices in my head. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely. Panic seized me. I was going to hang up. This was a mistake. Leo, he said, after a moment of silence. He had recognized my silence. He knew it was me. The sound of my name on his lips, spoken with such quiet certainty, broke the spell. Hi. I managed to croak, my voice a pathetic whisper. Hi, he said back. I could hear the smile in his voice. A warm, genuine smile that I could picture perfectly. I was wondering when you'd call. Relief washed over me in a dizzying, debilitating wave. I had to sit down on the floor, my back against the kitchen cabinets, the cool linoleum a shock against my skin. He had been waiting. He had been wondering. I wasn't sure if I should, I admitted, my voice trembling. I'm glad you did, he said, his voice soft. I was hoping you would. We talked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The conversation was stilted at first, awkward and full of pauses. We were two strangers who had shared a moment of profound intimacy, and now we had to learn how to be two people having a conversation on the phone. We talked about the train, about our jobs, about nothing and everything. It was the small talk I usually dreaded, but with him, it felt different. It felt like we were building a bridge across the chasm that had opened up between us, laying down planks of ordinary conversation to span the extraordinary night we had shared. Finally, he said, I'm back in town for 2 days before my next run. Are you free tomorrow? The question hung in the air, simple and direct. The final test. Yes, I said, the word coming out without a moment's hesitation, full of a conviction that surprised me. Yes, I'm free. We met at a small, quiet coffee shop downtown, a neutral territory. Seeing him out of uniform was a strange experience. He was wearing a simple gray Henley and worn jeans, and he looked younger, more relaxed, more approachable. But the quiet confidence, the steady presence, that was the same. He was still Elias. He smiled when he saw me, a real, unguarded smile that made my stomach do a nervous flip. He was already at a table with 2 cups of coffee, just as he had been on the train. The parallel was not lost on me. I wasn't sure if you'd show up, he admitted as I sat down. I could say the same thing, I replied, a small smile playing on my own lips. The awkwardness I had feared never materialized. We talked easily, naturally. We were picking up the conversation we had started in that cold, dark carriage, filling in the details of our lives. He told me about growing up in a small town, about the pull of the rails that had been in his family for generations. I told him about my passion for art, about how I had channeled it into a career that was safe but creatively unfulfilling. I told him things I had never told anyone. He listened, his gaze never leaving my face, making me feel like I was the only person in the world. After coffee, we walked. We walked for hours, with no destination in mind, through city parks and quiet residential streets. The city, which had felt so alienating and hostile just the day before, now seemed full of a quiet beauty. I was seeing it through new eyes. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the pavement, we found ourselves in front of a modest, brick apartment building. This is me, Elias said, gesturing to the entrance. He didn't say goodbye. He just looked at me, his expression open, questioning. He was leaving the next move up to me. I could have said goodnight. I could have shaken his hand and walked away, back to my empty apartment, back to my safe, lonely life. I could have kept him as a pleasant memory, a story I would tell myself on lonely nights. But I was tired of being an observer. I was tired of living behind glass. Can I see it? I asked, my voice quiet but steady. His smile was slow, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I was hoping you'd ask. His apartment was small and sparse, but it was clean and filled with a sense of calm. It was the home of a man who didn't need many possessions, a man who found his home in motion. There were a few books on a shelf, a well-tended plant on the windowsill, and a large, detailed map of the National Rail Network framed on the wall. It was a reflection of him, simple, practical, and quietly fascinating. He made us coffee, moving around the small kitchen with a familiar, easy grace. I stood in the doorway, watching him, my heart full of a feeling I couldn't yet name. It was more than just hope. It was a sense of rightness, of inevitability, as if all the lonely, disconnected tracks of my life had finally led me to this exact station, this exact moment. He turned from the counter, a mug in each hand, and saw me watching him. He stopped, and the air between us grew still and charged, just as it had on the train. He walked toward me, his eyes never leaving mine, and placed the mugs on a small table. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his hand gently cupping my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was the same touch, the same question. But this time, there was no darkness, no storm, no uncertainty. There was just the warm, golden light of the setting sun filtering through the window, and the quiet, steady beat of my own heart, no longer frantic, but calm and sure. "I'm glad you walked with me to the back," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "Me too," I whispered, leaning into his touch, into the promise of a new journey, a new destination. I was no longer in between places. I was no longer just on my way. I was home,